Hello, and thank you for joining me on Industry Meets AI, a podcast series where we try our best to absorb and learn as much as possible from founders and investors who are deploying LLMs and new AI products around the world's core industries. In this episode, we will be talking to Leopold Gasteen, whose experience spans across alternate investments and who is now building a company that applies AI to private markets. Now, some of those experiences include heading up biz dev at a $3 billion plus Nordic hedge fund, founding Edgefolio, an operating system for the investor relations function, specifically tailored for hedge funds, and also angel investing in other funds and startups. He is now building DeckMatch, which applies AI to investment workflows in private markets. The big theme for today is private markets, tech adoption across finance, and AI. So without further delay, let's dig in. Thank you so much for making the time today, Leo. Before getting to DeckMatch, I was thinking we'd start with your first company, and I was hoping you could kind of share perhaps your journey and the story of your first startup, Edgefolio, and what the kind of lessons from that kind of time period were.
Going back in time. All right, let's get out of the history books. So I suppose fresh graduate, just landed at a hedge fund as an analyst. But deep down in my DNA, I'm a lazy engineer, right? And so a lazy engineer tries to find the quickest point between A and B. And I just saw like a big disconnect at this hedge fund between how people were like able to discuss really intellectually challenging and deep things quite eloquently. But then also they would just default to doing things in a really dumb way. So sort of cold calling, spray and pray, attending industry conferences, in my mind, was a really inefficient, expensive way of raising capital. And probably a better way of raising capital would be more using behavioral data. So if we could set, so to speak, the honey trap for investors for them to leave behind their footprints, then we can start to see who's looked at our profile, who's interacted with what, and then translate that into sort of an intent or interest, right? And I decided to leave and build that. So that was the genesis of Edgefolio, was me seeing a system that I think I could have improved, like scratching my own itch, so to speak. Yeah, fast forward to today, it's still going strong. It's being led by my great co-founder, Rowan. It's servicing, I think, 70 to 80% of Wall Street banks as their de facto cap intro platform. Yeah, so it's pretty cool.
Could you elaborate a bit more on intent and what that means when it comes to, say, an LP kind of considering, say, a given fund? Like, what are the different kind of case studies or forms that may take place within?
Well, we're going into the territory of like false positives. Like if you were to take a very simplistic view, there's more or less a linear correlation between how much you interact with something and how interested you are in something. Generally speaking, time is our most precious commodity, so we try to allocate it wisely, at least more or less aligned with what we're interested in. So if you were to lay down an interactive profile where there's lots of buttons to click, lots of data to scrape and cut and slice every which way, as well as an integrated data room, then you're basically laying the groundwork for understanding, well, if you were to attribute simply a point system for every interaction, and let's say, for example, downloading a document would equate, let's say, 5 points, but analyzing a time series, 10 points or maybe 15, and then a peer analysis could be 20. If you were to then use those sort of metrics, then you can start to quantify interest, and on a very, very simple term, right? Then what you can't really do is remove the sort of box checking folks that just like to spend their time inefficiently. So it more or less equates to interest and intent. And it's definitely better than no data, that's for sure. So we basically gave way to like, sort of what LinkedIn did for who's looked at my profile. We gave financial products a profile. And we gave the owners of those profiles sort of behavioral data from which to sort of extract who's potentially a good partner for your firm.
Amazing. I like that kind of nomenclature there of profiles for financial products. You can kind of see who's viewing it, see who's visiting it, who's thinking about it, etc. And I'm wondering, just one more question on Edgefolio. What are some of the main kind of unique views that you feel you developed from that time period in interacting with the kind of alternate asset kind of manager kind of sector in terms of tech adoption and what it means to kind of succeed in that area?
So the average alternative asset manager has the same balance sheet as your average corner shop. They're not very cash rich. That's one lesson. A second lesson could be like whatever they spend on tech tends to get taken away from what's left for bonuses, etc. Like this, it all comes from the same pot. So there's a bit of a reluctance, and I think that comes from time at the sell side, right? Which is whatever we use on anything else we can't use on ourselves. So generally speaking, they're tough customers. Hedge funds are, at least, but they're getting better. They're getting more in tune with the times. That's for sure. And I think, to draw a parallel to our new sort of customer segment in the alternative investment space, which would be private market funds, I actually think that they're like even more demanding customers and potentially have less balance sheet, but they are far more attuned to technology and far more embracing of it.
So you think it's not just the kind of balance sheet question, but there's a kind of cultural dynamic at play. Perhaps you have younger cohorts who are more kind of associated with technology, and so they're open to trying new stuff out in their investment workflows in these firms.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, cool. So let's now move and zoom ahead. Could you share the DeckMatch story, in particular, the kind of broader thesis behind it, the product suite and the vision for the future that you have as you're building DeckMatch out?
Sure. One of my, I guess, close friends in the startup world, I came across, we crossed paths in like 2018 when he was building out HomeFair, which was a property estimation tool, leveraging, I guess, machine learning and large statistical models, which we now call AI, to figure out what is the right sort of property estimation using hundreds of parameters, such as view, 3D modeling, noise pollution, etc. That got acquired, and he spent a couple of years at the new company earning out, right? And in that time, I'd recently had some babies, left Edgefolio to sort of focus on being a dad, and got sort of sucked back into the hedge fund world. And then Walid, this co-founder of mine now, finished his earn out and gave me a call and said, look, this generative AI thing is pretty cool. It's a brand new paradigm, right? It's where no longer like where we're building sort of, like relational databases with buttons attached to it, where you just sell that for a licensing fee. It's really what you're selling now is the output, the work itself. That's pretty cool. That could be a huge change. Quite frankly, I had started Edgefolio in 2014. In between 2014 and 2020, you had this sort of like, I want to say wet farts of potentially new platform changes. There was like Web3 that came and went. And it was just generally a bit disappointing. Like there wasn't really any huge step changes in terms of what people were building, right? Specifically in B2B SaaS, it was just rehashes of the same thing. So this specifically was super interesting for me. And so Willie and I had a really deep think about like, what is it that we care about? What is an itch that we can scratch? And so we're both investors, right? For our sins, we're gluttons for the punishment. We do like to overexpose ourselves to the venture class, and between us we get between let's say 600 to 1,000 deals a year, to something of that magnitude, and which at the time, right? We both have small kids, we both have things that we're doing during the day, and we tend to miss out on some of the big ones simply because we just don't have the time to look at stuff. So wouldn't it be kind of cool if we just built something as a weekend project to see where we could go with this? And basically an API first approach to ingesting unstructured data, i.e. a pitch deck or similar, and basically come out with a JSON object that can basically make it a recommendation or not for us to look at. So basically like an analyst powered by AI as an API. Pretty cool. And so that's exactly what we went ahead and built, and we showed that to a few folks. And they turned around and said, look, this is pretty helpful. I wouldn't mind buying this. but it can't be held together by prayers and sticky tape. It needs to be a proper product. So we went back to the drawing board, established a company, raised a bit of capital, and then was in R&D mode for about 5 months, and then got our first customers thereafter. So yeah, we've been monetizing since January this year.
Incredible. And in terms of the way in which that product suite you see kind of developing and evolving in the future, what is that kind of broader vision you're kind of iterating towards as you kind of foresee it?
Well, I think it's a really unsexy picture from the 5,000 foot view. It's like you're basically building some AI workflows to take care of the donkey work that no one likes to do, which is cool. It's a wedge of sorts. It can't be a web application because that is just a point application that gets replaced and chucked out at a moment's notice. It needs to be operating behind the scenes 24/7, and it needs to be sort of, if you were to remove it, it would hurt, right? That's what the product needs to fulfill. And as a wedge, because, well, VC for us is an important wedge because I think they're probably the most attuned to technological waves in terms of customer profiles, but they're also very demanding customers, and they're also super underserviced because it's a very unattractive town. So there's only about like 12,000 VCs, accelerators, whatever you want to call it, globally. But the wider private markets and all the participants therein is enormous. Like, to give you a proxy, PitchBook, which I think services the wider private markets, I think you'll agree, has an annual run rate of $600 million, right? So if you were to like expand from just that small little sliver that is VC into the wider, you actually have a pretty big business to build. So for us, the missing part has always been around sort of discovery. Like, how do you find what you're looking for? Not necessarily how you sort of process things, but also like once you receive like a thesis from your partners, right? Like, how do you go about and discover and find companies that match that, right? And I think for too long, the industry's been stuck in this sort of like Alta Vista mode, which is like, I need to know these boxes. I need to check on certain databases to see what I find. And aside from that, it's network and sort of social collisions where you sort of find what you're looking for. And I think there's got to be a better way of doing that. So that's, I think, the next bastion for us.
Awesome. One post that I read recently was talking about the ways in which folks are trying to rejig their own thinking so they can become better users of these technologies because they're so powerful, but our default way of maybe perhaps working is one where we may not kind of use them. So for example, we may be slower to adopt technology because we're like, oh, we think our network is going to kind of solve this problem when it comes to deal flow, as opposed to just allocating R&D time to try these out. I'm wondering, what do you think, as you've now looked at these different asset managers, both in venture and in other areas, what are some of the kind of right mindsets that one should have as an adopter of these technologies to get the most out of tools like the one that you're building and other such ones, both in terms of trying them out and acquiring them, but then also fully integrating that into your workflow on a regular basis?
Yeah. I think there's a rightful amount of skepticism when it comes to sort of trying out new products. I realize it doesn't do us any service to say this, but there's a lot of shiny demos out there that are like really awesome to watch. But when it comes to sort of, say like stage ready, like production level, production quality applications, there's a lot that is left to be desired, I think. And it's typical of this sort of like early phase of the cycle that we're in, which is like we're just sort of figuring out how this all works and putting it together. And so there is probably a fair amount of justified or like warranted skepticism towards new tools, right? Because like, it's just another fancy demo, right? But then what I'd rather like try and do is have the saying like to peel the banana the other way, to look at things from a different perspective. Try and actually look internally and go like, what are the parts of my job that I really think are utterly mundane and boring, right? Those are prime for just being sort of automated, and that frees you up, right? That frees you up to do more meaningful things that AI couldn't possibly do. Typically speaking, that's like relationship building, all that stuff that AI just will never do. So identify first the areas that you think are right, that you could do with less of, right? That's step one. And then step two could be more along the lines of, all right, well, what's the best tools out there right now to do this, right? And then you can actually have a meaningful approach to sort of, because now essentially what you're doing is you're putting a price tag on the pain, right? Going, well, I spend like 20% of my time doing this donkey work, right? If I get that 20% back, that's super meaningful to me. So then you have sort of like a lens to study all of these alternatives through. And then I think there's no real way to go about it than just trying out some things, but trying to be fair and giving it a good try, right? Yeah, and I think that like if you were to go to the very beginning of like mobile technology as well, like when we were having these sort of WAP phones, that was touted as like production ready internet on your phone, and it wasn't, right? But that was the first generation of products on mobile, and so I think that we're sort of nearing the end of that maturity. We're actually now having a few more, or we now know what it looks like to be more like production ready in terms of at the application layer for Gen AI.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. I recently, and I say recently, partially inspired by our conversation, I made this like Notion dashboard where I kind of wrote down kind of Krish's AI use cases. And I've been kind of filling it in over time with different things, not necessarily that I hate, although I'm going to use that now as well, but different things where I'm like, oh, I would totally hire someone if I had the runway to do this, right? How can I get either a kind of bot or use even like some sort of agentic kind of architecture to get that done automatically in the background in some capacity? And how can I test that out over time? And I feel like the only thing I'd add to what you shared, but I appreciate, is you mentioned it's taking time for some of these kind of products to go from demo to production ready. And sometimes we can be a bit impatient with our first try of the thing. And I feel like returning every 3 to 6 months and seeing how has this vendor perhaps, evolved in their product as well, given that we're so early. I think there's a lot of kind of, alpha, so to speak, in being patient in that way as well, because you can find those unlocks that you may have ignored otherwise. So,
and also it's like there's a sort of survival of those that can stick around the longest. There's a survivorship bias to say like, all right, well, if you are still around in 12 months, it probably means that you have something that isn't just demo quality, right? That's at least what we experienced at Edgefolio as well, which is, hey, you're still around? Maybe we should talk. And so there's a lot of that as well. There's a lot to be said for that, like the survivorship element to it.
By endurance, we conquer, is that quote from Shackleton. Okay, so moving on, I'm thinking about some of the use cases from DeckMatch and the use cases in general kind of venture funds. If we were kind of getting a bit philosophical here, if we're looking ahead, say 10 to 25 years, and we're imagining the venture fund of the future or the private markets fund of the future, what do you think are some of the fundamental ways in which things have changed in terms of how decisions are made, operations are handled, and how it kind of functions within the broader kind of capital market environment? And feel free to kind of divide perhaps your thoughts in, base case / more speculative thoughts as well. So you can feel free to say stuff that maybe like, a strong opinion, but very likely held. But I'm curious as to what the range of outcomes you see on that front might be.
Yeah. Okay. Let me think about that. So you're basically asking like, what will the future, like what will the alternative investment firm of the future look like versus the contemporary one? Okay. So there's like 3 areas, right? There's like front, middle, back office for every type of firm. And I think all 3 will face some form of like efficiency gain. So let's start with the back office, which is like where the boring but important work happens, right? And how I view the back office is that there's no upside to getting it right, but there's a lot of downside to getting that stuff wrong, right? So we're talking like fund reporting, we're talking about compliance, we're talking about all of the T's have to be crossed and I's dotted. And so leaving that up to, let's say, an LLM to do this sort of end-to-end reporting, I don't think a stochastic model quite captures, like the stochastic output quite captures the importance of actually getting it right? 90% isn't good enough for that sort of function. So I think there's genuine and warranted skepticism towards like Gen AI on the, let's say, compliance, as in like end-to-end workflow. However, as an assistant or research assistant, just simple tools like Perplexity is super helpful, right? If you're, let's say, for example, you're considering marketing your fund in a new territory, you just want to ask some questions about, well, what are the things I need to do that, right? Those kind of tools are going to be helpful, but I would call them peripheral tools. They're not like core to the workflow. So I actually think back office will be maybe the last impacted of all, because it faces that exact thing, which is there's zero upside to getting it right, but there's a lot of downside to getting it wrong. So why take that chance? If we were then to look at, let's say, front office, right, which is, hey, you're the GP, you're the principal, you're sort of making investments, you're meeting founders, you're doing all this cool stuff. Or if you're the hedge fund, you're the PM, and you're carrying P&L. There's a lot of research that is effectively gathering disparate sources of data, right? And so if you were to replicate the opening of 25 tabs, which is essentially what we're doing at DeckMatch, right? You get a deck, you strip it down to its bare bones, and then you enrich the picture through an orchestration of microservices, which is now trendly known as agentic workflows. You've got there like a real chance at making that PM even getting what he needs faster, right? And potentially more reliable and potentially broader scope in terms of what you can retrieve. So I think you can actually have it all like better, faster, stronger at the front office in terms of research. I think that's going to be key. I think one area that will never be displaced, because even games like venture and private equity are fundamentally human games, right? Where it's, even if we on paper match, if there's no chemistry between the partnership and the founders, there's never going to be a deal, right? There needs to be a certain level of entente, of camaraderie, of basically belief that, we're in this for the long run. And that human element is going to be really hard to ever replace. So I actually think that there's only pockets of the sort of front office that can be enhanced. And I think that typically tends to be around the research, typically tends to be around, take things like for company A, who are the most similar companies, right now you're stuck with junk from Crunchbase or other that tells you some random crap based on fuzzy lookup or other, right? So I think there's a lot of power in augmenting research with AI for sure. And then everything else, right? So we just stick that into the middle bucket, the middle office. So that is the fundraising, that is the IR, that is client services, all that stuff. I think, look, for fundraising, it's sort of sales, right? And so there's a lot of sales automations tools out there, like how to write better emails, how to generate leads better, all this other stuff. I just think that it's sort of like the spam email. The first ever spam email was the most successful email ever sent because it promised, inheritance from a rich Nigerian prince or what have you. And the first guy who clicked was like amazing. But then as that catches on, that gets arbed away, right? And therefore, like now today, a spam email gets 0 opens and flagged, right? And I actually think that it's the sort of similar phenomenon we're seeing to a lot of these like generated emails that are maybe in the future they're indistinguishable, but right now they're pretty obvious to spot, right? They've been automated emails. I have an accent in my name, which owing to how some of the text is encoded on emails, I can tell who's put me into an automator, right? They haven't actually bothered to type in the accent. It's just that whatever program they were using doesn't accept French accents. So there's a lot left to be desired there too, I think, generally speaking. So I think, and I say this because, I worked on Edgefolio, which was trying to render client services more efficient through data, right? Like fundraising, investor relations, all that stuff, just making it way better, more streamlined. automating that entire outreach process and communications process, I think there's a while to go for that, for sure. And like, don't even get me started on voice. Yeah, that's I can't imagine there being robocalls raising capital. Who knows? Hopefully not.
I will share one thing. One of the largest funds in the US, from an AUM perspective, also I think it's just a general asset manager. It's called Fisher Investments, and their bread and butter are these robocalls to elderly people. And I'd imagine that they
they have a great moral compass, right? They're preying on the elderly with fake calls.
I just want to say
I get your point, but I'm more talking about institutional level, right? So like if you're looking to raise $100 million ticket from a pension fund, best not go in with a cold email and best not go in with a robocall is my general feeling.
I agree with that. And I think you mentioned that kind of idea of channel saturation. It's clear that as digital becomes more noisy, saturated, our attention spans become worse. And I know there's a massive trend in kind of events and in-person kind of interaction, so generating pipeline for kind of companies as well. So this whole, it does feel like a bit of a race to the bottom at times as well, but
I just think I think comes back to the same thing, which is like, there's specific demos for which it works well, but it's not production ready for this stuff yet, anywhere near it, I don't think.
Okay. Well, next question for you, Leo, is you built DeckMatch initially with a purview into your own private investment operations. Now, when you look at the kind of your peer set in terms of deals that you kind of receive yourself to this day, or just people you're kind of tracking in AI right now, would you be able to share the story of one or two companies that are really exciting you in terms of what they're building, really in any market? So this doesn't just have to be in finance, but in general, in any market where you think this is a great kind of use case or application of AI.
Okay. Well, actually not a million miles away. And I'm pretty sure you've spoken to Nick as well. But Voodoo VC is actually very cool because it's basically leveraging AI to do a matchmaking service, but it's also building out the rails for addressing something huge, which is a financing gap of several $100 billion in the African continent. Right. So I think what's more impressive, not to take away from the technology, but what's most impressive there is the mission they're on. It's enormous. And if they actually succeed at what they're doing, it's not only just a massive upside, but it can actually fundamentally change the lives of hundreds of millions of people, which is super cool, right? That's a massive, I can't say that for many other B2B businesses, but this one in particular has an amazing mission. And so I'll speak to that. That's applying, I would say, pretty sophisticated, but not the most sophisticated technology to a huge problem, right? And if we were to look at it from a different lens, like where am I excited about what I'm seeing in terms of AI being applied from the sophisticated lens? It's a very good question, actually. I actually haven't received all that many investment opportunities in that bucket that is like super sophisticated by my lens. But a few specifically like that seem sophisticated, that there's a million that I've seen of that I'm quickly like, I don't quite yet see the edge, is the application of computer vision to specific diseases, right? Because my take on it is that you just need good training data for that. And then you just apply it to a good computer vision model. So then Google could effectively just turn around tomorrow and go, we've open sourced everything, and then puts out all of these computer vision model businesses like out of business. So I'm a little bit skeptical of those. Where I'm really excited is specifically on like on sort of new new biotech that is sort of having a much deeper understanding, or biotech's being built off the back of new research that's emerging from understanding how proteins fold and how you can bind and how you can target specific enzymes. That for me is like groundbreaking, and that's only got unlocked by AI. That said, biotech is one of the areas where I can help the least. So I still haven't made an investment in biotech yet, but it's definitely one of the areas where I'm warming up to, for sure.
Okay. Interesting. I like that reference on kind of like biotech there because it reminded me, the way you spoke about sophisticated and like the frontier, that wasn't necessarily what I was thinking about. I just thought about interesting in general. But when you think about the frontier, highly speculative, odd bets to a certain degree. My favorite one I came across yesterday was a company called Earth Species Project, which is applying frontier AI to decoding animal communication, like how we can communicate with like elephants
Totally.
using AI.
It's pretty
And
awesome.
that to me is like astounding. Reid Hoffman backed kind of, pseudo grant equity, similar to OpenAI type of vibe. I'll send you a link to that later. It's pretty fascinating.
We're another great nonprofit to emerge.
Yes. Okay. So moving on, thinking if we can kind of zoom out a bit and think more about the kind of like frameworks you're developing around kind of thinking about AI beyond kind of at the product level. And I think first is, how do you think founders who are currently in the evaluation and experimentation stage, how do you think they should be evaluating the AI opportunities that they may be looking at in terms of building a product that is native to, the application of LLMs, etc.? I think one term you used, which I really appreciated, was the idea that you can deliver outcomes instead of just CRUD software. But would love to kind of get what you think, what advice you'd give to a founder in that position today.
I'm not sure my advice is very good, but we'll see. I guess time will tell. So I personally got a lot of anxiety for a lot of founders that I know every time that there was a new OpenAI dev day or a new sort of release from Google for their new Gemini models, right? So I'm like, here comes a whole bunch of features that are basically just replacing what these point applications do. And so that could have been everything from sort of, I mean, like, I don't need to really go into detail about this. Like, every time that they're like the YC 2022 batch is basically that, right? So summer 22 and winter 23 is basically like wrappers that just got slammed. So then the question becomes, how can I avoid doing what they're likely to be doing, which requires you to think a little bit about what the foundational models are actually building and what they're building towards? How do I get out of the way of that? Because that's just a speeding train that's going to destroy everything in its path. But rather, how do I benefit from it, right? So how do I make that really, really cool? So like a rising tide lifts all boats. So if you can learn to be a better or have a better business off the back of that, I think that's great. If, however, and see, this is like mediocre advice because it also sort of implies that you know what OpenAI is building. So for all I know, they might be building DeckMatch, right? Who knows? But for now, we seem safe because we're building workflows and we have our own proprietary data and we have our own flywheels that protect that. So we're building our moats, right? But building a moat used to be quite, I would say, like the only moats that exist today, right, are network effects and proprietary data. The rest is bogus. So whatever you can do to have those two things, great. You're going to be spared a painful outcome, I think.
Do you think that suggests that investing in new data sources and just new data ways of kind of like creating that data arbitrage, data protection around that new resource? What are some examples perhaps of where folks have gotten creative? I know you guys like tapping into that quite a bit as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. Can I ask you to ask it in a slightly different way?
Yeah.
Because
I think I
like,
phrased it back.
I'm trying to tap into recency bias here. No, I'm just trying to tap into recency here and I'm just coming up short.
I guess, okay, so like maybe I'll start with some examples. So when I think of like interesting models data capture, right, that were fairly new in the last few years, I think Tegas is that expert network that, in contrast to prior expert networks like GLG did not record the transcripts and turn it into a transcript library. They record the transcript and just give it to the person that acquired that conversation. In contrast, Tegas was like, well, we're gonna put all of these transcripts to a centralized library, and then over a 5-year time span, they have 40,000 expert transcripts, and that's their example of like a unique way in which you can capture data. I'm wondering, like, what are some examples perhaps of that you've seen that you found inspiring, where it's like, oh, people weren't capturing data here. Now we know it's valuable. Now they're investing in capturing that data.
Got it. So thank you. By the way, my daughter just came home from school, so that's my focus got split. So that's way clearer to me. So I think like there's a couple of, like Tigers is an interesting example. Sadly, got sued into acquisition by AlphaSense, but it was on the right track to building out some really good proprietary data. So proprietary data I see in two ways. It's one is like there's abundant data that exists out there, but it's super unstructured, right? Sure. All right. So if we were to acknowledge Tigers has built a great business, they've managed to tap into some proprietary data, and that's really like user-driven data. So it's like, hey, that data exists there somewhere in specific people's heads, inaccessible. It's not that it's unstructured, it's also unstructured, but it's inaccessible to the masses. So what they do is they've done that, they've aggregated it, and they've made it accessible. That's really good. And that's super defensible at scale. What I think is also defensible at scale, at least in the medium term, is that there exists. So, and this is quite similar to how AlphaLens is thinking about it, which is our new product, DeckMatch, is that there exists a lot of data out there on companies, right? That is well established. There's plenty of providers out there with firmographic data. But when it comes to product level data, there's a lot that you need to sort of piece together yourself. And what I mean by that is, what are the products they offer? What is the price points? Who are the targets? All that stuff. That's just missing. That entire category is missing. And so we looked at that as an opportunity to go, well, let's piece that together. Because, if you were to go and visit any company's, take, Salesforce or SAP's page, and you were to look through everything and all their offerings, you'll eventually piece together all of their products, their targets, and that would take you time, right? But once you have that picture, then that becomes quite valuable. And then you scale that over several million companies, then you get tens of millions of products. That becomes super valuable, right? So that's how we're thinking about it. And I think folks that are looking to aggregate inaccessible and disparate unstructured data and bring that and making it accessible are actually delivering a huge value to folks that need that, right? Because then you're just really looking at the replacement cost, like, oh, it's going to cost me to do this myself. I also think like then the third one, which is the sort of holy grail, which is really, really hard for anyone to replicate, is sort of behavioral data and like user generated data from interacting with your product. So let's say, for example, what are the most searched for terms? What are the most interactive deals? Or what are the most popular types of technology that are emerging? All of these sort of trends that typically are temporal data, right? That's really powerful, and that typically comes from a sticky, useful product. Did that make sense?
It did, and I would love to just kind of maybe just kind of poke at one particular point that you made and get a better understanding of it, which was you were talking about kind of the idea of like the value of that data, how to price it to a certain degree, right? You used the term replacement cost. I didn't fully understand, but if you could share a bit about how you think about, okay, one, we acknowledge that data is increasingly important because it unlocks new kind of capabilities for the LLMs, right? And it's a harder resource for others perhaps to kind of copy if you have a unique source of that. What are the ways to kind of numerically or like analytically think about the value of a given data source in, say, either a product's value chain or in a broader world where LLMs exist? If that makes sense.
And it's a very you're asking hard questions. Yeah,
it's a bit of a brainstorming session.
So I'm trying to think about like so how to assign a dollar amount to doing things. I mean, like cost of replacement is clearly one way to look at it. There's a few ways you can skin the cat, right? Which is like, well, what is the ROI that data has in-house? And then people tend to forget, but people always think, oh, I can build this myself in-house super cheap. I can do this myself. Then there's the cost of maintenance and keeping things fresh, right? So there's this sort of ongoing cost as well that you need to think about, like that is an annuity. There's no other way around it. Yeah, I don't really have a good answer for you. I'm afraid. I just think like there's a great deal of value to be had by basically convincing folks not to do the same as you, but offer it to them in a way where it just it's an absolute no-brainer to buy your product or buy your data because you've gone to the trouble of getting it in the best way possible, right?
Yeah. I think you've actually given a superb answer there, because those 4 criteria of kind of like replacement cost, ROI, what's the ongoing cost, and also this idea of like fungibility in terms of how competitive are other data sets for that use case or set of use cases. And maybe you could even kind of think about market size as well.
Yeah.
I think leads to some sense of underwriting. Say as you build out DeckMatch, I'd imagine that, say, 3-4 years down the line, you may look at new data sources from an acquisition standpoint, right? I'd imagine those would be part of the criteria for thinking, is this something that's like fundamentally unique to add to our repertoire or not? And I think that I wouldn't have thought about that otherwise. So
Exactly.
I appreciate that very much. So the next question that I'll ask is, how do you currently use AI in your work and life today? What are the top 2 or 3 use cases?
It's good. That's really good, man. So I don't want to give away my secrets, otherwise I'll be put out of a job. But so yesterday I interviewed for a customer success role, and the candidate had been through a couple of rounds already with the hiring manager. And so this was sort of me asking sort of deep and personal questions, I suppose, around like not walk me through your resume, but rather like walk me through something you're really proud of doing, right? Those kind of questions. I fed those answers that I got into Claude, right? And I then tried to, I then asked it to assume the role of a psychologist and just, hey, play this back to me and sort of highlight what are the certain markers we can have here for personality traits. And would that be a potentially good fit for the role here? And I found that to be quite helpful, like just in terms of, I don't have to do that extra layer of thinking. I can just play that off. Now, to what extent is that reliable? That's just an example that comes from recency. That was yesterday. Basically, anytime that I want to write a pretty fiery email, like I get pissed off or I want to sort of attack something head on, I typically write it unfiltered, stick it into Claude, and then just tell it, please draft this in a diplomatic way, right? And so I still get my point across, but I don't offend the recipient. In fact, I probably put my best foot forwards because it's like, Leo's a diplomat. Turns out I'm not. I'm just really good at using Claude. And then in terms of engineering, we started using Visual Studio, VS Code, but then like quickly moved over to Cursor and haven't looked back really. Where just like Andre Garpathy said that English is the new coding language, and it's not far off, to be honest. Like, if you think about what LLMs are really good at, it's just guessing the next token, right? And if the subject matter is very structured like code, then it's a pretty great use case. And so it's been super empowering, even for people who don't code. They've been able to sort of contribute in their own way in the team, which is pretty cool. I would put myself in that bucket. Like, I generally don't code, but I've started to do more coding because of it, which is pretty cool. So I think on the engineering side, that's been a no-brainer. And then in terms of market research, we use our own. We actually eat our own dog food, which is pretty cool. So, when we're thinking about who's out there in terms of competition, who could be a potential distributor of our products, who could be a good partner, like we basically have the best data in the world on products. And so we can start to understand, let's say, for example, we wanted to discover folks who sell also to private equity funds and corporate innovation teams at Fortune 500s. We can find them using AlphaLens. And then we can then go, are they competitive? No, cool. Then we can actually, if they're not competitive, but we share the same customer base, there's room for bundling, there's room for a lot of cool like cross-selling, right? So we actually eat our own dog food on that front. Yeah, I think there's a couple more. Oh, there's one that I tried to build that sort of sucks. This was homebrew, which is have a calendar, have a busy life. And so every morning, what I really want is sort of like Iron Man style Jarvis that tells me, hey, Leo, today you're meeting these people. Here's some conversation starters. And by the way, some fun facts about their background, right?
Hmm.
Try to build that. It basically required having more than just a mediocre grasp of coding, but also it did an okay job. It summarized my day. It read my calendar, but it was the actual trouble of finding interesting things about people that was just way off and subject to hallucination. Yeah.
And also given that some people are very online, I myself perhaps, and like completely not very online, equally as interested, but they don't have any, it's hard to find those data points to kind of grasp one conversation.
Yeah, but also the false positives. It finds another Leo Gasteen that isn't me. It's like, oh, really interesting fact about the person who has the same name, but is not the person you're looking for. So there's again, false positives is the enemy of production ready applications. So I say that's homebrew. That's not out there. I was tinkering away with it, but I think it has legs. If someone listening out there wants to build it and sell it to me, I'll buy it for sure.
And I think
I want a Jarvis that tells me about my day.
With that in mind, then I feel like the next question is something that's quite aligned with this, which is, are there any startup ideas that you'd like to see others build given where LLM capabilities are right now? Or even ideas that are not like venture scale classic startup, but just unique applications or things that you think are commercially interesting in terms of strategies of applying it, be it like maybe a firm that uses LLMs in a certain way, perhaps, or something like that.
Wow. So I'm huge I love D3, which is sort of like one of the main libraries for data visualization on the web, founded by a guy called Mike Bostock, who used to run data visualization for the New York Times. Really amazing. And he actually has I'll give him a plug. He's got something called Observable, which is a platform on which you can build your own D3 visualizations and fork others work. It's really, really impressive. Now, it's also renowned to be one of the most annoying things to work with because the learning curve is super brutal, right? And I would just love for there to be how you can now with artifacts, right? You can generate sort of working React code, right? And see it. That's pretty cool. That's probably the thing that sets Anthropic aside or ahead of the pack in terms of coding abilities. But in terms of data visualization, it's still back to the drawing board, and animations for that matter, right? If you want to do any sort of graphic animations, you're basically going to have to spend hours and hours and hours doing lots and lots of donkey work. I love both of those things, and I wish they were more accessible to the masses. Like I genuinely wish they were, just because I feel like if a picture paints it, if a picture paints 1,000 words, what does an interactive visualization paint? Like a book, right? It's amazing. It can unlock everything. And I think that, I think that would be an amazing. I wish that's on my strong wish list. If someone could, because Flourish, for example, is sort of like, you don't need to know how to code. You just sort of attach your spreadsheet and you can sort of make D3 visualizations. So that's pretty cool. What I'm more talking about is like reimagining things, like reimagining how things can interact and how you can tell stories. That's huge. Yeah. So that's number one on my wish list, because I generally think that sharing ideas at TED Talks is cool. Sharing interactive visualizations is next level for sure. So just making that more accessible to people to tell their own stories.
Amazing. I resonate with that. I like this explanation of like explorable explanations, and like Brad Fichte's work on these ways in which you kind of like create a model of something so that you can kind of, as you mentioned, like, tinker with the variables. So if someone says, oh, here's a projection for kind of climate change or something, right? Or like here's like a market size kind of model.
Yep. You
can actually play with what the inputs are versus just taking it at face value. And that being embedded in the product leads to just better epistemics. Two apps. I'm just referencing random apps here, but I've just been going down the rabbit hole the last week. Two apps you may like here. One is called napkins.ai, which does it just for kind of slides. So you can actually take some abstract concepts and turn it into like what would be perfect McKinsey slide kind of vibes. I know it's not the same as interactive, but that's one. And then another one on this front, I've completely forgotten it, so we'll have to figure it out next time. In any case, closing questions for you, Leo. I've been revisiting Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, recently, and you've founded a previously successful company. You're now building a new one. Everyone on Twitter talks about all their kind of your success stories and latest announcements. What I'd love to hear is, I guess, a story of a challenge that you've kind of overcome in that process of building Edgefolio or DeckMatch, and what the lessons from that may have been.
I mean, it's a bit of a roller coaster, right? Building anything. I think one is like, so one of the hardest things is when you are selling to someone like, these are on Edgefolio's website, so I can name them as customers. But when you sell to someone like UBS or Morgan Stanley, it tends to be, there's not very many of them, right? There's like 10 or 15 of them globally. Right? So their revenue is meaningful, and it's also pretty large. It also means you don't really get very many shots on goal, right? So you got to make it count. And when a deal falls through, it can feel like the world is just falling under, like, as in you're just falling through the world and just like, fuck, pardon my French. But then you have this sort of resilience, I guess, like this callous skin that you build. They're like, oh, well, another rejection. Good. On to the next one. And that's just something that comes with, you have to go through the pain first to emerge the other side, like a sort of a forged founder who can actually take a rejection. So I guess at the beginning I was a bit of a, I guess, wet behind the ears and just not very used to being told no and all that stuff. And also the other a really hard thing is like trying to disassociate yourself with and you and the company. It sounds really silly, right? Because you're obviously two different things, but you're so in it. It's all you live and breathe. And then if the company's not going super well, or if you've had like a bad run and some bad things are happening, and it can take a toll, right? My advice, I guess, around like fixing that is just like Churchill's expression, right? If you're going through hell, keep going. Eventually you'll get out of it. Perseverance, and really it comes back to that, like survivorship bias, that like, hey, there's a lot to be said for sticking around, right? So even folks who said no to us in the first year or in the second year, eventually, because now we have 70% of Wall Street as customers, like they've said yes, right? So there is a decent argument to be made for sticking around and going through.
Persistence pays off. I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, that doesn't mean being an annoying sales guy and calling the same guy the next day and the day after. That's not what I mean. I more mean like brush yourself off and keep going, right? And then eventually, if you do well, you will persist.
A strategic persistence in that case. So next question is, and this is the penultimate question. I appreciate you making the time, sincerely. Is what is a story that you can share with someone who's been particularly helpful or inspiring to you as you've gone on your journey of kind of building and investing in companies?
Wow. Probably the founder of Zenetup, actually, Patrick Berglund. He founded Zeneta, which is probably one of the most impressive tech companies that you can build out of Norway, right? It's basically taken 10 or so years to then become the industry standard for shipping, which is like probably the most important area of the economy that no one really knows anything about. So everything from the AirPods in my ears to the clothes on my back have arrived here by container, more or less, right? And then procurement teams and shipping teams interact with brokers to get the right price points for certain routes for the ISO containers. And Zeneta realized that the spread can sometimes be 80%. So they basically just came in and reverse engineered through what the Fortune 500s were paying. They reverse engineered an index that became the standard around which contracts were built. So it was a little bit like LIBOR in interest rates. the Zanetta index became like the golden truth for shipping routes, which is super cool. So Patrick, first of all, he built something enormous out of Oslo, which is really hard to do and global. So props to him. But he also founded his company in 2012, and I founded Edgefolio in 2013. And we shared the same first round investors as well. And we, I immediately like took to him because I asked him, hey, do you mind if I ask some due diligence questions about this investor before I sign these terms? And ever since then, we've been good friends, but also he's been really good at like giving me advice on even like, hey, dude, it's summer, take some time off. Like you need to sort of charge the batteries and you need to spend some time with kids and family, right? That's super important. So really appreciate him for that, but also like on all things like funding round crisis or sales crisis or HR crisis, I know I can pick up the phone and call him. So yeah, props to you, Patrick. You're a good egg. Thanks for that.
Oh yeah, I love to hear that. I think having those close friends who have been on similar journeys, but also who it's almost like founders therapy, right? That kind of makes such a difference to in those moments. Wonderful story. Final question for you, Leo, is our listeners are others who are interested in using, building, investing in AI. Do you have any calls to action for them, given what you're working on and given the purview that you kind of have right now? Any kind of final comment?
Wow. Yeah, like try and like ask yourself a deep and meaningful question. Like, why are you doing this? Because if you know why you're building this, then that's going to give you the sort of, when your tank is empty, you're still gonna keep on driving through, right? But if the answer is typically like, I really like the idea of entrepreneurship, that's not good enough. I think what a good answer looks like is something like the Vula guys, right? The Vula guys have a mission, and they're on a mission to address something fundamentally broken. And if they do that, it's great, right? And so like what I aspire ourselves to be as well, like we are on a mission now to make products way more discoverable so that capital can flow more efficiently, right? That has maybe not as big of an impact, but that has an impact globally if that works well, right? And what I want folks to do is to think a little bit bigger and be a little bit more ambitious than just, hey, we're going to make collaboration on PowerPoints easier, sort of thing. Like that's, yeah, I actually think that we're entering into an era now where, love him or hate him, he's inspired people to think bigger because he's taken on things that were unfundable historically, right? And so Elon, so whether it's building reusable rockets or electric vehicles or Neuralink, the list goes on, or the tunnel company, boring, right? Like there's a ton of things that individual has done to inspire generations to think about like bigger, much bigger problems to solve than just productivity ones. So my advice for this new generation of founders, of which I am one as well, still a student, still learning, is be ambitious and try and solve a really big problem.
On that note, I'll take that to heart myself as well. And thank you so much for making the time, Leo.